Hi there, well, good afternoon everybody. So I'm going to tell you a little bit, a sort of quick overview of large-scale hydro and outstanding issues with migratory fish. Now, large-scale hydro, we've heard some people mention this already today. Basically, where is it? Well, it's a significant issue that basically affects quite a number of rivers right up the spine of Highland Scotland, you might say, from Loch Lomond right up to the Shin. And this is a map here from one of the SSE's publications, but I've also stuck in there, as well as SSE, there's this Alcan system between the top of the Spey and Fort William, and there's also what was the old Scottish Power one down in the Dee in Galloway. So it's not just totally in the Highlands. But when these things were built, they did think about mitigation. They didn't just sort of think, well, we're not caring about fish, but they did think about mitigation often. And usually the thing that most people think about in terms of hydro mitigation was, adult upstream fish passes. So Pitlochry Dam, for example, is somewhere where just about everybody's probably been, and you've seen the fish pass. So these were quite common in a lot of the hydro dams. And in somewhere like Pitlochry, generally speaking, this fish pass works pretty well. But we did hear, but there are some examples where the fish pass design wasn't maybe 100%, and Roger mentioned about Spey Dam today. So there are some outstanding issues with fish passes. However, one particular issue at Pitlochry, you can see on the left-hand picture there, at the mouth of the fish pass, you see there's a set of screens, and that's to guide salmon into the fish pass. But for many years there were no screens because they thought they weren't necessary. And about 30 years ago, John Webb from the Atlantic Salmon Trust then was radio tracking fish, and he proved that fish actually sat in the tail race sometimes for months. And of course they were attracted to the flow from the tail race and didn't go into the fish pass. So as a result of that, the screens were reinstated. So one of the issues that you do find with quite a lot of these hydro systems is that there's a competing attractive flow, and sometimes adult salmon do get held up. So the main point here is that there's always some sort of ongoing management. You can't just leave these things alone. Somebody's got to look after them and make sure the fish are going up, and sometimes you have to tweak them. But that's adult passage. And I was just talking there to Roger over lunch, Roger from the O that is, and the big thing that's really been sometimes forgotten about is the downstream passage of smolts. There was much less known about that back in the day when these schemes were designed. And there's a couple of issues that arise from that. First of all, you might say that there's what was really well known was turbine damage. So if salmon smolts go into a turbine, potentially they can be minced up, and that was well known. And so as a result of that, in quite a number of schemes, they would put in big structures to install screens. So for example, in the top right here, there's a big structure. This is in the River Lion in West Perthshire. And you can see as a close-up, there's these fine mesh, sort of bar screens. It's a huge structure over the top of a hydro intake to stop smolts going in. But the smolts are then expected to go through this little fish pass to find that hole and get away. So they did put in a lot of this, thinking that this would get smolts past. But not everywhere, because it is believed that there are turbines and there are turbines. And low head, big turbines like at Pitlochry are not deemed to be a problem for smolts, but as power stations, as the head gets bigger, and effectively the danger to smolts increases. So in effect, in some of the lower head turbines, they didn't put in screens at all, and the fish were just allowed to go through the turbine. But even with some of these, there are still questions to be answered. So for example, this is the River Gore, basically on Rannoch Moor, at the west end of the tunnel system. And the Fisheries Committee of the day said in their report that this power station, that fish should be screened out of the intake. But when the Hydro Board built it, they only put in an adult screen. And the Fisheries Committee said, but we meant smolts as well. And the Hydro Board said, well, hold on, this is the same turbine as they have in Tongland and the Galway D, and we don't hear of problems there. So that's basically the state of some of the science. Now, I don't know if there are problems with Tongland, but I would suggest that some of these things really do need to be revisited. And it was interesting, Roger was telling me how Alan is currently tracking fish in the Alan Kettlewhite on the Awe. And so that I think this needs wider application. But having said that, SSE have been very good with a lot of this stuff. So, for example, on the Gore, it is recognised that when the big turbine is switched off, the flow to maintain a flow in a river downstream is maintained by a small compensation turbine, and that's recognised as a smolt masher or a potential smolt masher. So what they agreed with us there is that during smolt time, they shut the com set off and they let the water down the fish pass. So it comes barreling down the fish pass during smolt time so that smolts don't go through there. So that, where these problems are recognised, things are done to try and improve things. However, one of the things that really wasn't recognised so much at the beginning was it's okay, you can put screens in the right places, but sometimes the fish have real difficulties in getting past these facilities. And in the earlier the scheme, the worse this was. So one of the extremes here is, we've heard today Roger talking about Spey Dam. So at Spey Dam at the head in the Alcan system, the smolt screen and the offtake to Fort William is actually at the opposite side of the loch to the fish pass. So that's actually the worst design you could ever get. So if smolts are attracted to the main flow, then they're never going to get out of the place. But even in areas where the turbine intake is close to the fish pass, you can still get problems. So here is Clooney Dam, just upstream of Pitlochry, and what you can't see, but to the left of the photograph, there is the intake to the turbine, and then you have the fish pass. And historically, there was a smolt screen on here, and there's a fish counter in the fish pass too. So up until between the 50s and into the 80s, you can see that the counts were sort of 100 or 200 fish a year. And we were fortunate, really, that the lab did a lot of work here. And it came to the conclusion that basically, because the screens were on, that the smolts just milled about the loch forever and didn't get anywhere. So in the early 80s, the screens were taken off. And it was considered that there would still be about a 30% loss, but this would be better than a 70% loss. And indeed, what then happened thereafter was that the population did increase for a good long period. So that helped. But still, there is still 30% loss on this tunnel system. So it's better than it was, but it's not perfect. So this is a difficult problem to mitigate. And so, for example, and it's not just with us that the problem is quite widespread. So, for example, in these two photographs here, the top one is up at Loch Leuchert, I think it is, on the Conan system. And there they had a similar issue. Smolts didn't get out of the loch. But because there is a barrage at the top of the loch, the Conan board were able to put in a smolt trap. And so what they do there is that they catch the descending smolts and trap and truck them downstream and bypass the reservoir, in effect. But on the Shin, on the other hand, where they've also got a similar problem, because they don't have any sort of barrage and it's wild rivers, as I understand it, the Kyle board have to resort even to trying things like rotary screw traps, which, pretty inefficient to catch as many smolts as they can and move them downstream. So really, I think, that's not acceptable, I would say. That's not a solution. But at the end of the day, trying to sort this really comes down to resources. And so this diversion of smolts is really a big outstanding issue with quite a lot of these hydro schemes. I mean, you might say, well, that's all in the past, we've learned from that. But having said that, not necessarily. There are problems in the horizon because I got this photograph here from Brian Shaw. This is Foyer's pump storage scheme in Loch Ness. And there seems to me to be practically no work done in this, but in a pump storage scheme at night, they're sucking water out of Loch Ness up into a reservoir. And so effectively, you've got another outlet river. Now, if a smolt is moving around Loch Ness and encounters this, it'll maybe think this is the River Ness, and the smolt might end up milling about that. So are these an issue? And I'm told that there's proposals for something like 3 new pump storage schemes on Loch Ness. So if that was to go ahead, this could be a real headache for smolts. So I see this as something, it's a real priority for work to be done on to try and understand more about these attractant flows. And moving on quickly, one of the other issues that hydro has caused problems with is obviously water abstraction. And there are, I wouldn't say that a lot of them aren't huge problems for salmon, because a lot of the hydro abstractions are on quite steep tributaries. But there are places, and notably the River Garry in Perthshire, where there was a whole river, basically over 20 kilometres of river, where it was completely abstracted. Now, through the Water Framework Directive and through the River Basin Management process that Nathan has told us about, this was all supposed to be sorted. A lot of these have been identified, and the Garry was supposed to be fixed by 2012 in the first plan, but it was done by 2017. So there's a number of others that are in the thing that should be finished by 2027, and yeah, we hope to see the hard stop and those sorted soon. But of course, none of this operates on its own. There are sort of, you don't just get one issue. So for example, in the Garry, there is an intake, and salmon in theory can now get up there, but the next section above the intake has now got water restored, but there is no smolt screen over the intake, and any smolts would be diverted into that. But again, Nathan's plan has identified this to be sorted by 2027. So again, we'd hope to see a hard stop there and not see this venture into RBMP4. So nearly finished. One other issue that people don't really think much about hydro, and is an issue that's not captured in the whole RBMP thing, is actually the effect of regulated flows. And so what do I mean by that? Well, here is an example on the River Lion, a Tay tributary, and what we found is there's a big dam, and the water is discharged, the compensation flow out of the bottom of the dam. And what we found was that the invertebrate community in the upper line, in a lot of the line, is odd. Right? It's a changed invertebrate community, and it was a PhD done on it, and it might be partly to do with an altered temperature regime, but we've also found that there would appear to be an altered chemical issue too, that because you've got all this sort of runoff, spate runoff, etc., trapped there in the reservoir, that things like calcium levels, etc., are lower in the discharge than they are in the inflowing streams during dry weather. And so there's been impacts, and we find that the juvenile salmon population there is very slow growing. So actually, in terms of the whole hydro scheme in the Tay catchment, this issue on the River Lion is probably possibly the biggest one of all for salmon, and it's not recognised. And then you've also got other issues, for example, being identified here, right here in the Spey, that because the water, because it's hydro-regulated, it's kept low so that the water table doesn't rise as it would in a natural river. And the Spey Board had a study done that showed you potentially in dry summers, this could then affect flows in the Spey. And these are all issues that aren't actually considered. And finally, as I say, none of this happens on its own. For example, we take the upper tunnel here. There's a whole series of dams, Pitlochry Dam, Clooney, Dunalister, Rannoch, Gore, a whole section. And what we find there is that in the lower part of the river, round about Dunalister, even though the fish have got to negotiate, cleaning, all the rest of it, you still get good numbers of juveniles. But once you get on to Rannoch Moor, up to the Eich and Loch Lydon, that area, there are pretty much no juvenile salmon. So salmon have been lost for the whole west of the catchment, probably as a cumulative effect. And of course, teasing that out is very difficult. But these are the sort of challenges that hydro still leaves with us. Thank you.